All right, we're going to move on to Jack. You have seen the new Ant-Man film, which has had, shall we say, a frosty reception in its reviews this week. Is it as bad as people have said? And also, did you go into this film with kind of conscious of that and try to kind of find the good from the film where possible? But just, overall, what is your thoughts and feelings on this?
Yeah, so I saw the tomato meter the other day at 53%. It may have changed since then. And I decided to not click on a single review, to not look at really anything kind of in depth, because I just thought, right, I had this week off, the nice little jaunt over to Germany during the week, and it's just been nice to not think about work for a week. And I thought, right, well, as a treat for myself on Friday, I'm gonna go to the first showing of Ant-Man at my local Cineplex, and just check it out for myself, rather than kind of reading anything. So now, do I think that it's a bad movie? Yes and no. Right? I think it's a combination, because genuinely in here there is kind of a good movie, I think, if they executed it a bit better. But it's incredibly maddening that they didn't manage to find it with the elements that they have, because the actors in this movie are so good. Like, you just look at the time on the like the people in the movie and the time that the majority of them have on the screen, which is not a lot, by the way. Like, for instance, like Evangeline Lilly realistically has about maybe 10 or 11 lines in this movie, I think, and most of them are moaning at her mum for not telling her what's going on. Michael Douglas doesn't have a lot to do, even though he does have an exceptionally cool moment. Bill Murray is in the movie for what can only be described as a cup of tea. You got Bill Murray, okay, right? And the whole...
Hey, that works really well in Zombieland, though, all right?
Yeah, because they did it right, but they didn't here. Look, so story of the movie is Scott Lang is happy with his life as Avenger, decides to write book about his life. By the way, I'm not going to go deep into any spoilers, just in case anyone's worried about that. And his daughter gets arrested when he's promoting his book. He goes to bail her out. She gets arrested because she was trying to, with a group of fellow teens, prevent police from exiling homeless people from a park in San Francisco, which is a genuine sickening thing that really does happen in San Francisco. So I'm just like immediately like, oh yeah, movie, thanks for reminding me that the world is an absolute cesspit of awfulness. You'd think even in the world with Avengers that things would kind of be a bit better. But anyway, so in the process of bailing her out, he finds out that she's been arrested before, and that she's also been working with basically all of the crew. So Michael Douglas, Evangeline Lilly, and Michelle Pfeiffer, the family, the Ant-Man family, to kind of build this device that can basically send pulses out into the quantum world, so they can map out the quantum world and figure out what it looks like, just as a sort of discovery project. Yet, unfortunately, her sending pulses out into this place means that somebody responds to those pulses and they all get sucked into the quantum world. And then the movie begins. Right, now, 95% of this movie is in the quantum world. 95% of this movie looks like it was painted onto the side of a van at a music festival. Because it's just like, big, wacky, crazy vistas of just CGI nothingness. And yet at the same time, it manages to be really dark, which I didn't really understand. I would get it if you had like different phases of light and stuff. But when we saw the quantum world very briefly in the first Ant-Man movie, I kind of get why they didn't spend too much time in it, because it looked like really complicated to kind of make this whole believable universe, and like the choices they made in the darkness and all that, I just assumed was like a marriage of convenience of like not having to spend too much of the CGI budget on that, and then the rest of the movie was like a regular fun Ant-Man movie. But the whole movie being in there just meant like they committed to like the lightscapes and the look and everything, and it was just not very nice to look at all, really. And again, I just kept thinking about the characters. Like, I think, like, again, the actors, like, Paul Rudd is awesome, right? He's one of the most likable people in Hollywood, genuinely seems like a nice person, is in lots of funny and entertaining movies, and he's a very easy guy to root for. But they just don't really give him a lot of cool stuff to work with in this movie. He spends a lot of time kind of having the movie happen to him rather than being guided by the movie, or like being a guide for the movie, which I just didn't really like. And again, it was just a gross misuse of all the actors except Jonathan Majors, who, as people will be aware, and I will give nothing away, is playing Kang in this movie. Any second that he is on the screen is very, very good. He is that perfect combination of just a little bit psychotic, but also, way smarter than everybody else in the movie. And this is a movie with a lot of extremely smart people in it. So, it's just a very, very strong performance. But one of the problems I have with Kang in this movie is that, there's no jeopardy whatsoever, right? So we've already been introduced in the Loki TV show to the concept of, multiverses and different threads of the timeline. So that even if this Kang were to suffer an awful fate and was actually defeated by the Ant-Man and his crew, that there's still a bunch of other Kang out there. And this because the next movie they have announced for the Avengers is going to be based around Kang. So you're like, well, there's going to be Kang stuff in the future. So you immediately feel absolutely no jeopardy whatsoever. That probably none of the main characters in the movie are going to die because, even if they do, there's all of this quantum energy and fucking, timelines and all of that stuff that you can get different versions of them. Like, one of the main plot points of the next Guardians movie is that it's Gamora, but it's not our Gamora, but it's still a Gamora. So it's like, well, even if one of the characters in this probably dies, it's like, well, do we just get another version of them in the future? Like, will they remain permadead? Is that going to happen? Probably not. So just don't feel the weight of any of the jeopardy in the movie. You feel it maybe for some of the sort of, side characters who come into the movie and bits and pieces of people that you meet in the quantum realm, but it just feels like an episode of a TV show almost, which a kind of 2-hour plus movie really shouldn't feel like that. It should have its own contained stories, its own interesting plot developments and twists. Character development is absolutely just scant in this movie. Like, what? As I said, brilliant actors, really interesting characters. You don't really genuinely feel like there's any development in this. Like, they do some interesting stuff between, or try to do some interesting stuff between Scott and his daughter, and then they just kind of abandon it for the big fight at the end, and then it's just like, okay, well, blah, 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 without going into any details about what happens in the movie. And because there's always a big fight at the end, right? So as I'm watching it, all of this stuff is just kind of washing over me, and I'm like, well, right, I'm interested about what they're going to do with Kang and how they're going to set everything up, but as I'm watching the film, I don't feel emotionally invested in it because I don't have the character development and I don't feel the weight of the jeopardy. Now, there's some really cool moments in the movie. They do some really interesting things. The concepts are good, and like the actual like rigid structure of the film is pretty decent. The way they play out the third act and the final climactic battle is pretty cool, but it just doesn't pack any of the punch that it should, and you don't really feel the weight of it at all because you just have this knowledge in your head that it's not really gonna go anywhere, and that all of the important stuff that happens with Kang is gonna happen in a future movie, and that all of the stuff that's happening with Scott and the whole Pym family is just gonna be probably sorted out and resolved by the end of the movie anyway, because they're gonna be fine. And that just kind of strips away any emotional development or attachment. And by the way, Catherine Newton, who plays Scott's daughter Cassie, I know she's a good actress. I've seen her in other things. She is genuinely horrible in this movie. I don't know if it's the dialogue. I have to feel that maybe it is a little bit of the dialogue, or the way that she was told to play it, or maybe that's just a choice that she went for. But it's clear that they're trying to get her to kind of be the emotional center of the movie. And there's one bit where she has to give, again, no spoilers, but what is considered a rallying speech, right? There's a lot of quantum world, trouble between different factions without going into too much detail. And she has to give a rallying speech. And literally, it is so bad. The dialogue, the delivery, everything about it is just so flat. And yet this is the thing that kind of inspires a potential rebellion, and you just don't buy into it whatsoever. It's really hard to watch this movie and feel anything but frustration for what could have been much, much better. What you can see in places has potential. What contains all of the elements that could make a really great movie, characters you love and actors that are great, and it just comes together to just make something that's really bland and sort of devoid of any, deep emotional attachment and peril. And yeah, it just ends in a bit of a walk out of the cinema, shrug your shoulders, and wait for the Avengers Kang movie to come out, because that will actually finally get some resolution to the whole Kang storyline. Does the version of Kang die in this or not? You don't know, because I'm not going to tell you, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really fucking matter, does it? So yeah, that's Ant-Man, and my word, is it just disappointing. I don't know where they go from here with their movies. They need to make the movies. Well, they need to make the movies about the characters more. They need to have some character development. They need to have some snappy dialogue in them, because there's this. I forgot to mention the worst bit of the movie, but it's a massive spoiler. But they bring someone back from a previous movie. The CGI used to bring them back is among the most hideous, 1991 video game quality bullshit you've ever gonna see. And there is a bit of dialogue between Cassie, Catherine Newton, and this person who is brought back, who I won't spoil. And it's about 30 seconds, and it is the most awkward exchange I've seen in a movie that costs a couple of $100 million, to the point where you're like, could they not have made them read these lines again? Was no one there on set that day saying, actually, that was shit. Can we please do that again, please? I want a reread of that. No, they just left it in the movie. Again, sorry, Catherine Newton. I know she's a good actress, but fuck me. And that is just indicative of what feels like a general lack of quality, of depth, because they're going towards something else. And it seems like they're looking so far into the future as to what they're trying to set up, that they're forgetting that the actual body of these movies matters. The stories matter. The character development matters. I hear people always call out Thor: The Dark World as the worst Thor movie, right? Which is fine. But in that
fairness,
movie,
it's not even the worst Thor movie now, but that's
no. That up until that point, right? But in that movie, there is I would say, very interesting development between the relationship of Thor and Loki, which is a key moment of that. You get the moment when Natalie Portman meets, Thor's mum and dad, and, all of the associated awkwardness with that. And there's actual character development in that movie and interesting things that happen to the people in the movie that you like, and understandable and believable things, even if the body of the movie and the villain in the movie kind of sucks. This movie has a killer villain, a really great, incredibly strong acting performance from a great actor around what is really shitty dialogue and really shitty plot development,
which is like fun. And the funny contrast to like the rest of the Marvel movies, where I think the general consensus was like, movie is really good, villain kind of sucked, and now it's like, no, we got the villain this time, the movie kind of sucks.
But the villain's good. But like I said, Garrett, like, we know there's an Avengers Kang movie coming up. So you know that even if this version of Kang dies at the end of this movie, or is sucked into some sort of like, you know, void, or is like bashed on the head with a toaster and dies from a brain hemorrhage, like, none of that stuff matters. And
like, that would be like a cool reveal if like in this movie they killed him. It's like, yeah, fuck it, we did it, he's dead. And then like the end is like, no, there's more of him. But that was the end of Loki. Like, you know, there's more of him.
Yeah.
They've already done that.
That was the end of Loki.
It's the problem with Marvel at the moment, it's one part them having to look forward, but it's also one part them having to always look sideways because of the television shows. And I think that while you can see the logic and the business case for building out the MCU with the television shows, I think it's also been the thing that's hampered the films more. That, and obviously the visual effects where they are, which probably the television shows haven't helped that because they've stretched out the resources they have. Because I think you can see the clear like decline in the quality of the films, both visually and just, you know, in their general pacing and whatnot, because of those two factors of having to look sideways and having to look forward. And, you know, this is the least invested I have been in the MCU to this point, because partially the quality of the stuff hasn't been that great, but also just it's an oversaturation of MCU to this point.
You're also starting to really feel the fact that they are homogenized, and that you do have directors and writers who have to stick within certain boundaries. Therefore, there's not much creative choice and not much risk taking. Like, one of the things that I really loved about the Doctor Strange movie, which again was uneven, but like leagues and leagues better than this, were some of the weird, creepy Sam Raimi choices in the movie.
That feels like a Sam Raimi film.
Yes, right? Yeah. And that meant it felt different from the rest of the MCU movies. It made it feel original and it made it stand out. There's nothing about this that makes it stand out, which sucks because there's so many elements in this movie that could have been really good. And there were things in the movie that were actually good. They were just linked together by shit. And that sucks. And you know what? It really hurts to say this because I was a massive, massive MCU fan. And even I am calling on it now. Like, I think, Garrett, you tweeted something the other day about reading all of the reviews to this movie and stuff. And I almost replied and just said, mate, even I am starting to not feel hyped about this. And if they've kind of lost me, then they must be on the point of losing the real kind of super mega fans as well. You're always going to have the people that just kind of will argue to the death that something's good regardless of, you know, quality or not, just because they love something and they buy into it so much, right? But me, I'm really starting to see the cracks, feel the cracks, and just feel incredibly disappointed because this was like a can't miss franchise, and within the space of like 3 years it's gone from a can't miss franchise into a very occasionally they'll get me excited or invested, but then that's probably because I'm seeing something from a character that they've set up better in a previous movie, or they're bringing back somebody from a previous movie to get the cheap pop, you know, wrestling style. That sucks. I don't want to feel like that about the MCU. This was my this is like my refuge, like my blockbuster refuge. I knew there was like 2 or 3 MCU movies coming out a year. They were always going to be a blast. I either go and see them by myself or with a pal or something and get really excited for them. And today I didn't have as much excitement until maybe like 5-10 minutes before, and I was like, come on, right, Ant-Man. The first 2 Ant-Man movies were both pretty good. I really like all the people involved in this. Surely it's going to be good. Jonathan Majors is going to be good because he was sort of like real creepy, but like, you know, smarter, holier than thou presence in Loki. And all of that stuff is in there. It's just in there in a shell, in a corporately squeezed movie, in something that looks like a fucking failed Pink Floyd album cover. And is it ever disappointing, lads? It really is disappointing. I mean, even with the 53% that I saw before, which I don't know, may have gone up or down by now, like even after that. And everything that I mentioned, there's 2 post-credits movie, obviously not going to spoil that, 2 post-credit scenes at the end of the movie. But even they basically render what you've seen in the movie largely pointless as well. And you're like, normally these scenes at the end of these movies are meant to make you excited, but they're not telling you anything that you didn't already know. They're setting up things you already knew were coming, and they make the movie, the ending of the movie, feel kind of useless. Anyway,
you know what's interesting as well, because Ant-Man and the Wasp sort of suffered a little bit from this because it came right before Endgame, but like the way they not got around it, but what works about Ant-Man and the Wasp, not to say that it's like a great film by any means. And I think, Garrett, you were speaking about this, or I remember we kind of mentioned this on Twitter, that like part of what makes that work, and you know, the original Ant-Man as well, is that the stakes are low, and it's a refreshing change of pace. And because we've got to this point of that power creep where really after Endgame, what can you do? You know, you've had half the fucking universe annihilated and then brought back in the blink of an eye. What more can you do past that? And obviously the answer is like the multiverse, but you get to a point where the stakes are so high, and it's part of why like the first half of WandaVision was incredibly refreshing, because the stakes felt a lot lower, and then obviously, you know, they escalated towards the end. And even for the problems that, say, like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier had, it still felt low stakes. And it's why probably Hawkeye is the one that's kind of stayed with me the most, because it just feels like a kind of like Christmas camper sort of film, and I really like the kind of chemistry between Florence Pugh and Haley Steinfeld. So it feels like Ant-Man doesn't feel like the subject material to escalate the kind of tension to the degree that it does, certainly off of what's, you know, going to come next. And yeah, like that brief clip that I saw on Twitter doing the rounds, I went back and I watched like 5 minutes of the original Iron Man, and it really is just like these are 2 entirely different franchises at this point in terms of like, you know, what they're going for visually. And I'm almost curious, like, what kind of like auteur director that could they bring in to see what they would look like or feel like in a kind of neutered down MCU version? And I'm trying to think like what a Wes Anderson Marvel film would look like.
Well, the funny thing is, who was originally tied to Ant-Man? It was like
Edgar Wright.
It was Edgar Wright.
Let's bring in an auteur director who will bring his own voice and vision, and they boot him to the curb because he did that too much. And like, it's naive to think like these were never producer-driven movies. They were always producer-driven movies more than director or writer-driven movies. But it does feel like since Endgame, like the ratio of which the films have been producer versus director-driven has just skewed more and more toward producer-driven. Or it's just over and over again, you get films that feel like they're serving some kind of corporate need or some kind of future setup. And like the thing you're watching in front of your face that you paid, whatever, $12, $13, $14, however much a cinema ticket is these days. I'm an old man. How much do I pay for my cinema tickets? But however much that is, like this thing you're watching is pointless. Who cares? Like, what's the point in sitting there? And yeah, like post Endgame, I did say that on Twitter, where post Endgame, where as you said, the stakes were half the universe is gone. You can't go much further than that. So for a while, they should have like really reined it back in and done some like personal, straightforward tales that are just.
I mean, they sort of did a little bit. Like the Black Widow was a
but even then, like the end of that movie is a typical. There's sleeper cell agents that are going to destroy the world, and like the same with Shang-Chi, where it's like the first half of that movie is really cool, and then the last half is like evil dragon thing is going to burst out of that door and destroy the world. It's like, stop it. Just do like a Kingpin where he just wants to take over a city and some dude stops him. Can we not do that for a while? Do we have to do end of the world stakes? Can we just do like boots on the ground, straightforward, easy stories to tell instead of all these. And as like the bigger problem is like they're veering further and further from like how grounded the first few phases of the MCU was. Like it was all Earth based, and now they're pushing further and further space based and multiverse and quantum realm based, which requires infinitely more CGI work at a time when the quality of their CGI is deteriorating at a rate that is almost unbelievable. And it goes back to the thing we were talking about Psychonauts, where it's like, it is not the case that artists are not good enough to make these films look good. That's not the case. There's tons of artists in the world who could make this film look phenomenal. It is the time and money they are given to make these films look good that result in why they look terrible. And that's the case. Like, all of these movies look bad now. And they didn't.
It looks like van art, Garrett. Van art.
You go back and you watch Iron Man, it's like some of like the 2008, 2009, whenever that film released, CGI, a little small bit rickety, but like the films now are more rickety than Iron Man was. It's crazy that like it's because they're producing so much, and apparently like the vision of what they want changes a ton during production, so that it turns out a lot of the CGI is done like in 4 months instead of 2 years, in which it should be. It's all that stuff. There's some nightmare stories about how the CGI in this film in these films and shows are done, and why it turns out as bad as it turns out. And as I said, it's never the artist's fault. It's never.
Can confirm first-hand account from a person who is my friend, who shall not be named, who has worked with one of these companies. That is exactly how it is. And if he's listening right now, I'd imagine he would be nodding broadly at all of the things that you just said. And by the way, it's not as bad as what you've just said. It's worse.
And it shows. Like, that's the thing. It's not the case that like they pull it together in the end and, you know, they're getting away. They're not getting away with it. It looks terrible.
No.
Van art. This movie looks like van art.
I don't know. Like, I'll be seeing this tomorrow, and maybe I'll come back next week and be like, wait a minute, well, you were so wrong about Ant-Man. I had the best time of my life. I doubt it. But as I said,
even by your level of Cruncherian takes, Garrett, I would be pleasantly surprised.
Everybody else turns on it is the moment I'll be like, you know, guys, it's actually pretty good.
I think, Garrett was trying to defend VAR officials when we started this call.
There is an unhealthy media culture around VAR. It's just what I'm saying.
But like, I think the only thing that you might defend is you might defend Catherine Newton as Cassie, and you might say, look, it is the dialogue that she's given and probably the instructions that make her performance so awful. But when you are meant to be one of the emotional centerpieces of the movie and you are that bad, it deserves calling out, unfortunately. I kind of do feel for her though, because she wasn't given a lot to do. But yeah. Look, the only thing I care about, Garrett, after you've seen this movie, is that you confirm that Jonathan Majors is in fact the man.
He was phenomenal in Loki, so I have very little doubt that he's also not phenomenal here.
He brings it here too. Yeah, he brings it here too. And not that it's a spoiler, you can imagine that there is some conflict between him and some of the people in the movie, because how would there not be? And some of the choices they make in that, I'm just like, oh, really? But anytime he opens his mouth and is just given dialogue, like I could just watch, if it was just like an hour of him explaining why he's doing what he's doing and setting the whole thing up. Which is
basically what the end of Loki is. Like, that's the last episode of Loki.
Yeah, but if he carried on doing that, it would be awesome.
Which is him and Tom Hiddleston sitting at a desk just chatting for like a half hour, and it's actually awesome.
It is, with his Apple.
Those two would make that work. That would be tremendous.
That's because they're both very good actors.
Paul Rudd could make that work, but apparently they didn't.
He could. So could Michael Douglas. So could Michelle Pfeiffer. Michelle Pfeiffer is very good in this movie, but she could have done so much more. We see cool flashbacks that explain her quantum past, but they could have done way more with that, like way more interesting things than they did. They didn't do this. They didn't execute this. All of the good things in it feel less good because the rest of it was so badly done. I'm sad.